Welcome to yet another video on Java 8 series. Today's topic is about finally block. We are going to look into different aspects of finally. What is finally? In in case of exception, how it behaves. In what in case of if you're having a return statements written in try, catch, and finally block, how the sequence is executed and what it will be returning it. In case of in the situation like when in what situation the finally block will not be executed. So let's take a look at finally key block. So what is finally is a uh, block where you write a code along with a try catch combination. So if you see here, we have a try block, we have a catch block, and finally block. So this particular block, finally block, is always called up no matter what happens. Uh, Whether there is an exception, whether there is an no exception, so this particular block is always called up this is always written in a combination of try, uh, catch, and finally. So in case of exception handling, uh, this try catch block is written, and then there is a finally block which is already written. So we'll look into different scenarios. So in case of exception, okay, so let's look at it, right? Let's say I have some exception which is being thrown in the try block. So what will be printing out? We'll check it out. Okay, so finally will be still printed or not? We'll check that. So let's say we write, let's say I'm dividing something by zero. So if you see, if you divide something by zero, you already know there is an arithmetic exception is being thrown. Now, uh, what all things will be printed here? Okay, so will only this will be printed, or will what all things will be printed? Let's look at it, right? Let us run this particular code. So now, if you see here, it it prints both the arithmetic exception and then finally, right? So you, no matter like this particular finally block will always be executed whether there is an exception or not. Okay, there are some scenarios but we'll look into it bit later. Yeah, now let's say I'm just commenting it this out and I'm trying to get an string. I'll try to check some value, right? So what I've done here is I've defined something as string with this null. So there is no value in it, it is a null, right? And I'm trying to invoke this particular equals method on it. So when you're trying to invoke something on a null, you already know what happens. It gets a null pointer exception, right? Now let's see what happens in this particular scenario. It's almost behaving the same. This particular block will be executed and ultimately this system or the finally block will be executed. Now, uh, now we'll look into uh, another scenario. Let's say everything is fine over here. We'll just print out something as some dot println. We'll just print something as block. Now, what we'll do is that we'll look at how it will be, what it will return when we return something, right? Let's say we have a method defined well, and then we are trying to return something. So what will be the final output, or what will be the final return statement in case of different scenarios, right? So first we'll just be calling this particular static method from a main method. So what I've written a method over here. So if you see same scenarios, I will be first calling it with the I'm calling str with an equal method which is null, right? So let's see what is by return, right? I have written a catch block which returns 1, a catch block which returns 2, another catch the general exception which is 3, and then it finally returns 4 for an finally block. Now let's see by running this particular thing what it will return. Now if you see finally block is already return. I think let's ignore this particular part now. But if you see this particular method is called up, right? So what happens is here it is str, right? It will call, right, and then there is an exception. Now exception, it will come here uh, to null pointer exception, but it will not return it here. Ultimately, it will go to this particular finally block and it is returning 4 over here. Okay. So even though it has got the exception, now we will see, like, whether this particular in order to make sure that this particular thing is already called out, right, we'll print it to just see that this particular block is executed or not. Okay, let's rerun this. Now you see here, even though this particular block is called out, it did not return it from here. It finally called the finally block and then it returned it. Now let's say we'll take a scenario of str, and then we'll look for division, arithmetic exception, right? So let's try it out. What will be the output, we'll see. So before that, let's uh, print something here as well, arithmetic exception over here, just to see this particular code is still executed, right? Now if you see, still arithmetic exception is executed, but it did not return 1, it returned 4 over here. Okay. Now let's say we'll see, like, when this particular in what situation the finary blocks will not be executed. So even though there is an exception, even though there is an the code flow doesn't hamper or there is an error, right, there is a still provision where we can actually exclude or skip the calling, right, of finally. So we can stop that. So there is a method which is exit under the system class, so we can actually call this. Let's see how we can run this, right? So what we will do is that I will write this particular statement over here inside this. Okay, I'll just comment this out. Okay, now if you run this particular thing, let's see what it will return over here. Now if you see, let's ignore this finally, but if you see, it has come here and it is already exited over here. There is no exception, so this particular block is not executed, and ultimately it went into shutdown. Okay. Just to showcase you, like this particular method is stopped here only. So I'll just print it out something like, oh, okay, whether this will print it or not, we'll see, right? If you see, this is not printed, so that means it went inside this method and then it ultimately exited over here. Okay. Now let's say if I am commenting out and I am trying to uh, okay, so let's say there is an exception, okay, in the arithmetic exception. Now I wanted to uh, we'll see like what it will return, right? Arithmetic exception, we'll see. Okay, so whether what exception it will return over here. Let me run this and see whether it will return 4. Earlier, if you see, it had returned 4, right? Now, what happened is that there is an exception, arithmetic exception. It printed, if you see here, this exception is printed. Now, after this particular thing, it exited the block, right? So, the program is halted over here. So, neither this was executed, neither this is executed in this case. Similarly, if you comment this out over here, and then if you place this inside this particular uh, block, it will behave similarly, right? Let's see. Okay, I have to uncomment this. Let's see, let me run this. It will behave similarly if you see here, right? It has not written anything. But in case of, let's say, now there is no exception. Okay, I'm just printing something as sys, okay, right? let's say I'm not doing anything, right? I'm just printing something, let's say the finally return method, right? So what will happen now? There is simple, right? Now what we'll see, like, what it will do, right? It will print or not, we'll see. It will return this particular as 4 or not, we'll see, right? There is no exception. Ideally it should return 4, right? Now let's see what happens. You see here, the finally block is already executed over here, but it and it also called this particular system exit, and then it did not return below the system. The program halted here itself. Hope you found this video helpful and you are able to understand the different scenarios and in what scenario finally block is used. Thank you for watching.